Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you're new to the channel, my name is Rabbi Cass from thesofercenter.com. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so when I make future videos about tips about tefillin and mezuzahs, you'll get notified. In today's video, I'm going to answer two questions which I get asked all the time. The first question is the age-old question: why is the tefillin strap cut on an angle? If you own a pair of tefillin, surely you've noticed that the Tefillin Shel Rosh, the Retzuos that dangle down from the Shel Rosh, and the Retzuah on the hand tefillin, all of them end with the Retzuah cut just like this. And the question I get asked is, why is the tefillin strap cut on an angle? Or worse, somehow somebody will be concerned that the angle of the strap is not cut correctly, and they're concerned whether there's a problem with the tefillin being kosher or not. So that's the first question. The second question I get asked all the time is, can I cut the Retzuos myself? Let's say you order your tefillin and it's a little bit too long. The Shel Rosh straps are touching the ground when you're sitting, or maybe when you're standing, or the Shel Yad, the Retzuah, as it winds around the Shel Yad, it has a very high, it wraps around many times, and you don't want it to wrap around 7 times. You want it to wrap around 3 times. Can I cut it shorter? And if I can cut it shorter, what do I need to know in order to make sure that I'm doing it right and that I don't make a problem, ruin my tefillin? So these two questions I'm going to answer today. The first question I'm going to answer first is why the tefillin is cut on an angle. You're not going to believe the reason. Are you ready to hear the reason? Unlike all the other aspects of the tefillin, which many of them are Moshe Messinai, we don't know the reasons why we do it exactly like that, because it's just tradition from Sinai. Or many of the reasons we do know, the sofer knows, but the average person doesn't know. But there is a reason for it, a reason in halacha or Kabbalah. The tefillin strap, the reason why it's cut on an angle is simply because it's practically easier in order to, the making of the tefillin, I'll show you right now. When I'm putting the Retzuah through the bias, it's easier to push it through when it's cut on an angle, like a needle and thread. The point of the needle is much narrower, much pointier, because it's easier to poke it through. Same thing with the Retzuah. This is called the ma'avarta, and sometimes it's wide enough, and sometimes it's not wide enough. And when the ma'avarta is not quite wide enough, if the Retzuah was cut flat on an angle just like that, many times we'll have difficulty pushing the Retzuah through the bias, and by making it pointy, it goes through so much easier. And not just when we are pointy. I'm laughing. You're probably laughing also. Oh, I should have thought of that. The reason, not just when we're putting the Retzuah inside the bias, but also when we're tying the tefillin knots, just like this. When we're making the knot, it's also easier to tie the knot when it's pointy, because it pushes through that much easier. It just so much easier to work with and tie the knots and put the Retzuah in the bias when the end is pointy, and that's the reason why the tefillin strap is cut on an angle. Now, sometimes people call me and they say, oh, like I said earlier in the video, they're concerned but the angle is not cut right. Usually that's an instance where they'll show me the Retzuah and it looks something like this. And if your Retzuah looks like this, and if that's why you're watching the video, I'll explain to you why it's like that. Maybe your Retzuah looks like this. It's like abnormally pointy and it just looks really weird. The reason why that's probably like that is probably the space here that allows the Retzuah to fit through is really narrow. And it's the only way it was possible to pull it through was that the sofer had to cut it like that, just so at least the tip of it will point through, and then after that I'll take a pliers and we'll pull it through in order to pull the Retzuah through the bias. What happened probably was the sofer who made your tefillin for you either wasn't particular, didn't really care about it, or they forgot. I mean, if I have to do that, I'll always go afterwards and give it a fresh cut, just so it doesn't look abnormal. Not that it's a problem if it's cut flat or really pointy. It's just not what we're used to seeing, and I don't want people to have a concern that there's something wrong with their tefillin. So that's the answer why the tefillin is cut on an angle. If you're surprised that that's the reason why, write it in the comments and say, I can't believe it. Okay. The second question, which I get asked all the time, is, can I cut the Retzuos myself? And the answer is yes, you can definitely cut the Retzuos yourself. And yes, there are a couple of things you need to know in order that you do it properly. So before we make any improvements to the tefillin, it's always important to say L'Shem Kedushas Tefillin, which means I'm doing it for the sake of the mitzvah and the holiness of the tefillin. The next thing you have to know is what can you cut it with. Unlike tzitzis, which cannot be cut with barzel, with metal, tefillin you can cut it with scissors. So if you have any pair of scissors just like this, that would do the trick in order to cut the Retzuah. Now the parts where people would typically want to cut will be the Shel Rosh, because it's too long. When cutting the Shel Rosh, there are various different opinions on how long the straps need to be. Bottom line is the right strap should be longer than the left strap. That means when you're wearing the tefillin on your head and you have a strap on the right and a strap on the left, however you cut it, make sure that the right strap will end up being longer than the left strap. There are different opinions on how long it should be. The most widely accustomed custom is that the left one should be at least as long as the chest, and the right should be at least go down at least until the belly button. Okay, hardly anybody has a Retzuos that low, that short. Almost everybody's Retzuos are longer, so it's usually not a concern about cutting them too short. But if you do cut them, again, make sure that the right one remains longer than the left side. The other thing I will tell you is when you're cutting the Shel Yad, don't just wrap it around your hand and then cut it, because if you have the custom to make a yud under the palm of your hand or to tuck it in 2 or 3 times, do that. Put the tefillin on as if you would normally wear it, tuck it in, and then make the cut. Because, you know, they say measure twice, cut once. You can't uncut what you cut. So make sure you have it and you're wearing it comfortably. Don't just assume how much you need to cut without actually wearing it and doing it. So make the cut when you're actually wearing the tefillin, so you know exactly where you're going to cut it. Then the pieces which are cut off have to go into shemis, which means they have to be buried, like any holy item which is no longer has a use. Okay, so you have to make sure you put that in geniza and not just throw it in the garbage, and treat it with the proper respect that it needs to have because it was already used for a mitzvah. And lastly, just to finish off the video, there is actually one part of the tefillin which does have to be cut on an angle, and that is the yud of the tefillin. So if you looked at your Tefillin Shel Yad, you'll see that you have just like this, and here's the yud of the tefillin, and this is the foot of the yud. So in order to mimic the shape of a real yud, which kind of like the foot goes a little bit towards the left side, so we cut it on an angle over here in order to mimic the foot of the yud. So that's why this over here is cut typically on an angle, although there are some opinions that would also say that even if this is cut flat, it would still be considered kosher. And one last thing, I did mention in the video where I talk a lot about Retzuos, that in my tefillin, if I have to give somebody 2 pairs of tefillin, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, and I make them both black on black straps, then the Rashis I'll cut it on an angle, and the Rabbeinu Tams I'll cut them flat. If you do get such a pair of tefillin from me, or perhaps your sofer did a similar idea, then if you do need to cut these Retzuos shorter, let's say the Rabbeinu Tams, make sure you keep the angle flat, because if you cut it on an angle, you will now lose the only way for you to identify externally the Shel Yad of your Rabbeinu Tam from the Shel Yad of your Rashi. And so just make sure if your Rabbeinu Tams are cut flat in order to help you identify what's Rashi and what's Rabbeinu Tam, keep that flat angle. Okay, I hope this video was educational and you learned a lot. If you did, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you on the next video.